What is the biggest you in the history of art? As you could probably imagine, in a timeline that spans from antiquity to the modern day, throughout the careers of millions of artists and through the creation of tens of millions of artworks, there are certainly many cases of revenge in the annals of art history. But Matthew, what is the best one? I have always, for one, favoured the story of Artemisia Gentileschi and her painting of Judith slaying Holofernes. Oh yes, a masterpiece, no doubt, drowning in a sea of classical revenge and redemption, for at the tender age of 17, while in the comfort of her home, Gentileschi was assaulted by her art teacher and father's friend Agostino Tassi. And if that isn't terrible enough, the act was done in the presence of a friend who did nothing at all to help her. But the story of Gentileschi's humiliation doesn't end just yet, because upon discovering the incident with his friend, Artemisia's father proposed an offer that Tassi couldn't refuse.
I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse.
Yeah, right. To preserve his daughter's virtue, Artemisia's father demanded that Tassi marry his daughter, which meant that for the foreseeable future, against her will, Gentileschi would be forced to bed the man who assaulted her at his own leisure. That is, of course, until Tassi decided that he was done with the arrangement and backed out of the marriage entirely. Artemisia's father, who decided that now would be the right time to feel outraged, took Tassi to court and would see him sentenced to 2 years in prison for his perverted assault on his daughter, and all was restored. A happy ending, right? Well, actually, no. Because in what could be the most badass act of revenge of the century, Artemisia Gentileschi went on an assassination tour worthy of its own Hollywood blockbuster. And in the only way she knew how, she canonized Tassi into the piece of shit Hall of Fame for everyone to see for the rest of time. If you're familiar with the period, you'll recognize this painting by Caravaggio called Judith Beheading Holofernes. If you contrast that version of the story with Gentileschi's, you'll see that some major changes were made. In Caravaggio's version, we see a moment of hesitation. In Gentileschi's, we see determination. In one, we see pity. In the other, we see duty. And in the place of Judith, she paints herself. And in the place of Holofernes, she paints Tassi. And the rest, my friends, is history. Holy fuck! What a story! That has to be it then. The biggest act of revenge in the history of art. What a brave woman. Bravo! Yes, brave she was indeed. And despite this story being one of sweet revenge, there is another story that you've almost certainly never heard. One that lives in the most unsuspecting place, by the most unsuspecting person. And it's so big and so vicious, I almost didn't believe it myself when I heard it for the first time. And in fact, if you've never visited the Vatican, or more specifically, the Sistine Chapel, there is a very good chance you would have never heard the tale of Michelangelo's The Last Judgment. For this story, we'll need to rewind all the way back to 1504, where over the span of 6 months the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel had sustained a crack, rendering it unusable. Then Pope Julius II would hire Piero Rosselli, a friend of Michelangelo, to remove its existing artwork and effectively set in motion a sequence of events that would revolutionize the art world forever. Julius II, the warrior pope, whose papacy undertook an aggressive campaign to unite Italy under the Catholic Church, was an advocate for powerful propaganda and decided to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica to symbolize the potency of his power. The truth is, however, he needed a grander place to house his own tomb, and who better to design that tomb than Italy's greatest prodigy? So he summoned Michelangelo from Florence to Rome in the early half of 1505, and for a time it looked like he was going to get what he had wanted. That is, of course, until he and Michelangelo got into a heated argument, probably for creative control, and the artist escaped back to Florence. Now, if you've made it this far in the story, you'd probably have guessed that Julius II was pissed. But he didn't have time to stew in anger, because a short time after Michelangelo had escaped, the Pope had come up with another clever idea. Why don't I paint the ceiling of the chapel to make it the greatest piece of art the world has ever seen? I imagine him saying that to himself. But our Pope had a very obvious problem, which was that the man he had in mind for the job was long gone. So he asked Piero Rosselli to write a letter on his behalf to coax the artist back to Rome. I won't bore you with the back and forth, but long story short, after some careful negotiating, Michelangelo, on the condition that he would have complete creative control, was convinced to return to Rome, and finally in 1508, his most ambitious project ever, would get underway. Over the span of 4 years, from 1508 to 1512, Michelangelo would create what many would argue is the most impressive series of artwork that the world has ever seen. 9 giant panels depicting 9 spectacular scenes from the book of Genesis, surrounded by a range of other biblical figures and stories that break every notion of what is humanly possible at the highest level of art making. He shows us perspective at a scale we can hardly comprehend. He shows us composition and colour and symbology, and he does it all in 4 short years. 4 short, torturous years, and vowed, upon its completion, to never paint again. Wow. So basically he said, "F*** you" to the Pope. Is that it? Well, I don't see how that's bigger than the Gentileschi story personally. Maybe I'm not understanding it. Hang on. Our story is only just about to get good, because you see, 25 years after the Sistine Chapel was completed, Michelangelo was convinced to return to Rome, and this time, paint the chapel wall. And, in a most spectacular encore, he created the insanely detailed 13.7 metre by 12 metre Last Judgment, a giant fresco depicting the second coming of Christ and the final and eternal judgment of God on all of mankind. 300 anatomically extravagant nude characters, blending the worlds of the mythological and the moral in a violent composition filled with biblical tales and cheeky Easter eggs. Like this example here of Saint Bartholomew with his flayed skin, done in the image of Michelangelo himself as a gesture to perhaps suggest that his time with the church has left him as a shell of himself. On the left of the image, we have the ascension to heaven. In the center, we have Christ, the Virgin Mother and the Apostles, and on the right side we have the descent to hell. Wow, this is incredible. Everyone must have loved this. Not everyone. You see, nearing the fresco's completion, Biagio da Cesena, the papal master of ceremonies, popped into the chapel for a visit and absolutely shat all over Michelangelo's efforts. Not only did he throw a fit at the nudity on the wall, but is said to have remarked that the artwork was both appalling and fit only for a brothel. And that, my friends, was all it took. It was the straw that finally broke the camel's back. And in what would become arguably the biggest "f*** you" in the history of art, Michelangelo would take out his rage like no artist ever really had. At the bottom right corner of the fresco, ground level, guarding the portal to hell, is an image of Minos, the gatekeeper of the abyss, painted in the likeness of da Cesena for everyone to see. And if that isn't humiliating enough, he sports a pair of donkey ears and is wrapped in the coil of a snake who's biting the tip of his bit. But wait, because it gets even better. The papal master of ceremonies was so angry, he ran to the Pope and demanded that it be removed. And in a statement so gangster, it could be a rap album. Pope Paul III is said to have told him, "My jurisdiction does not extend to hell, so the portrait must stay."